During World War II, there emerged an enduring image that shocked the world, an image depicting a Japanese soldier standing over a crouching prisoner, ready to take his life with a drawn sword. This haunting picture was found on the body of a deceased Japanese major, and upon its discovery by American soldiers. It was believed to be the sole surviving photograph of a Western prisoner of war being executed by a Japanese soldier. The image symbolized the brutality exhibited by certain armies during the war, evoking anger and distress across the globe. However, delving into the story behind this picture reveals the brutal execution of Leonard Siffleet. Leonard George Siffleet, an Australian born on January 14, 1916, in New South Wales, had a relatively normal early life. Growing up with his parents and siblings, he developed a passion for sports and adventure. In the 1930s, he left his small town and journeyed to Sydney in search of work, with dreams of joining the Australian police force. Unfortunately, his aspirations were shattered when he was denied a position due to his poor eyesight. In August 1940, as the Second World War broke out, Siffleet was called up for the militia, also known as the Australian Army Reserve. Initially, 10,000 militiamen were summoned by the Australian government to provide continuous service, stationed at guard posts throughout the country to watch out for potential invasions. Eventually, the number of called-up men increased to 40,000, receiving training and eventually serving in the Pacific as the conflict drew closer to Australia. While Europe bore the brunt of the war, Australia remained relatively safe. However, after the attack on Pearl Harbor and the assault on British forces in Malaya, the risk of a Japanese invasion on Australian soil became a grim reality. By April 1943, as the Japanese advanced into New Guinea after the loss of Malaya and Singapore, the threat of invasion loomed large. Initially stationed at the RAF Station Richmond in the Searchlight Unit, Siffleet served as a guard for a brief 3 months before tragedy struck. His mother passed away during that time, compelling him to return home to care for his younger brothers. Consequently, he left his job and sought to continue serving his country, enlisting in the 2nd Australian Imperial Force in September 1941. Assigned to a signals company, Siffleet went absent without leave twice and even got engaged, indicating that communications might not have been his ideal role. Fate led him on a different path, one that thrust him deep into the midst of the Second World War. Siffleet underwent training in radio communications and volunteered to partake in special operations. He was subsequently sent to the service's reconnaissance department of the Allied Intelligence Bureau in Melbourne, where he continued his training. In October 1942, Siffleet was transferred to the Secret Disease Special Unit, a detachment that operated behind Japanese enemy lines in Southeast Asia. This unit primarily comprised Australian soldiers but also included British, Dutch, Indonesian, New Zealand, and other personnel. They undertook numerous operations, conducting guerrilla warfare and gathering intelligence, much like the Special Operations Executive in Europe. Siffleet's exemplary skills earned him a promotion to sergeant after completing additional training. He later transitioned to the M Special Unit, another secret reconnaissance unit tasked with operating against the Japanese. Renowned for his competence and youth, he was considered one of the finest soldiers and was handpicked to join Operation Whiting. Operation Whiting was a joint endeavor between Dutch and Australian forces in New Guinea. It involved establishing a coast-watching station in the hills above Hollandia, Dutch New Guinea, an area under Japanese control. The mission required a perilous trek through Japanese territory to establish a base camp for observing the enemy. In February 1943, Siffleet and the Whiting team flew into Benabanur, commencing their journey through the treacherous jungle. After months of arduous travel, covering 500 miles on foot and 230 miles by boat, they finally reached the Lumi airstrip on June 14, 1943. Subsequently, the Whiting group departed Hollandia, accompanied by 66 native individuals. However, their fortunes quickly took a turn for the worse. While on a reconnaissance mission, Stavement and Pataval, two members of the team, were ambushed, resulting in Stavement's death. Pataval managed to escape and return to the camp, but Siffleet and the remaining men decided to flee to the south. Initially, things seemed promising for the group. However, while having a meal at a local settlement, 100 locals surrounded them, escalating the situation into a hostile encounter. Faced with aggression, Siffleet fired his gun at one of the attackers, injuring him, and briefly managed to evade capture. However, his freedom was short-lived as he was quickly apprehended and handed over to the Japanese by the locals. The men, including Siffleet, endured beatings, torture, and interrogation at a Japanese outpost before being transferred to Otarpai. The Japanese subjected them to inhumane treatment in an attempt to extract information about their operations. Ultimately, they were condemned to execution for their actions. On Otarpai Beach, Siffleet was led by the Japanese to his final moments. Blindfolded and with bound hands, he knelt down on the sand while a sizable crowd of Japanese soldiers and natives gathered to witness his execution. Yasuno Chikao, an officer, approached him with his sword drawn, ready to carry out the beheading. Another member of the Japanese army, a private, was ordered by Chikao to photograph the macabre scene, Siffleet's beheading. This chilling photograph, capturing the seconds before Siffleet's death, stands as one of the most haunting images of World War II. It depicts the helpless and blindfolded Australian soldier, emaciated and haggard due to his severe mistreatment, as Chikao prepares to bring down his sword. Siffleet sat in a pre-dug hole in the sand, alongside two other men who would also face decapitation before being buried. The brutality and horror conveyed by the image deeply impacted many, especially considering that Siffleet's photograph was one of the few surviving pieces of evidence depicting a Paus execution by the Japanese. Initially misidentified as another soldier, the image was later correctly attributed to Siffleet and published in Australian newspapers. After the war, Chikao, the executioner, received a death sentence, which was subsequently commuted to imprisonment as he was deemed to have merely followed orders from his superiors. Leonard Siffleet's image haunted people during the Second World War, evoking profound emotions and continuing to distress audiences to this day. At the core of this chilling photograph lies a young Australian soldier, just 27 years old when his life was tragically ended on that fateful beach.